It's Monday, December the 20th here in Seoul, and right over my corner you'll see that there's a black a pane window. It's a storefront. Yeah, it belongs to a coffee shop. Now, I was out walking tonight and I noticed that it seemed sort of dark, a lot of businesses, and I realized that as of this weekend, the Korean government's social distancing scheme kicked back in. Now, this started early on in the pandemic, and then it tapered off, and it was eliminated altogether in November. But unfortunately, in November, there was a rise in infections, and then Omicron came onto the scene, and the government basically ratcheted back. It pulled back, and it went back to social distancing. Now, the term social distancing is kind of vague, and what you have to understand in South Korea is the whole concept of lockdown is very, very different from what one finds in most European or North American or South American countries, or Australia or New Zealand for that matter, China. And that is that there's not sort of a total shutdown. People sort of aren't locked into their homes. Businesses aren't utterly shut down except for purely essential ones. What a lockdown here means is a shutdown of particular businesses. You do notice it, but it's done with a much lighter touch. For example, around a year and a half ago, my gym started shutting down. First it reduced its hours, then it shut down for a while, then it opened again, but you couldn't go into the shower room, the regular shower room, which has sort of like public baths and so forth, the mokyoktang. And there are all these sort of like subtleties, these levels to the way social distancing worked. The result, ultimately, is that in Korea, it feels in many ways that the whole concept of lockdown just never happened. I mean, it happened in a very sort of targeted kind of way. Whether those lockdowns were entirely scientific or whether what is happening right now is scientific, for example, you still can go to a restaurant. And as long as you're in a group of 4 people or less, that's fine. And the restaurants can get pretty crowded at times. So does that make any more scientific sense than, for example, closing down a cafe early? These cafes, by the way, are open during the day. If the lockdown was sort of brought up to another level, they would lock down entirely. But that would just be the cafes, not the restaurants. And so you sort of get the picture. In my opinion, the way the Korean government has handled this has not been perfect. For example, there was a real screw-up with the way that the Omicron virus got into the country. However, it is more aggressive, for example, in terms of quarantining than Canada or the United States, and I think that's paid off. And its tracking and tracing is very, very good. Again, there are excesses. In a small city called Bucheon, they're talking about using AI and CCTVs to sort of track infected people. It sounds very Orwellian, and there's sort of an outcry about that. But for the most part, the tracking and tracing, even though it's much more aggressive than what one would find in Canada, where people would protest hugely, because what the government officials do is they take your smartphone and they look at where you went by looking at your locations, and they check on your credit card to see where you bought stuff and so forth, and figure out who else was in the same spot at the same time and track them down too. That's how it works here. So these sorts of strategies would probably not be politically acceptable in a lot of Western countries, but they work. And so here we are, and we'll see what happens next. But so far, so good, basically.